Hello, this is John of John's Travel Adventures. During the pandemic, it wasn't easy to travel. We spent a lot of time at home and we looked at online in places in Moalboal, I talk about that before when we talk about looking for a place in Moalboal. But we decided once we can travel, we wanted to find our little dream place in Moalboal. What we found wasn't exactly what we saw online, but anyway, I want to show you some of the problems and unexpected things that happened. There are some things that are expected, like a foreigner can't own land, so that makes it a little more challenging. And there's other things about the fees that is just reading online. They say transactions costs are very high in the Philippines, and that is quite true. In fact, we didn't expect as much as that. When we saw someone, a realtor, and he does other things too, has a nice fancy office, so he has a high overhead. So he showed us the place. They asked you your price range. And when I gave a higher range, just thinking that everything was perfect, I might go for that. But then once you see it and you see all the extra expenses, it sort of leaves you daunting. So the next aspect is, doing due diligence. A good lawyer should be able to find and make sure everything's fine. But the other company that found us this great big expensive house on the top limit of what I was prepared to pay before I realized all the other fees, with due diligence, they said we wouldn't show you a place unless it had a good title, which is what you want. Because in Moalboal, there's a lot of places that have like a tax receipt, they pay taxes, but they don't really have a title. And that's the problem of buying something and spending a lot of money, and someone else could come along and say they own it, or it may get taken away from you some way. So you do want to have a good title, but for around 40,000 pesos, around $800 to do due diligence, well, that sounded a little high, and especially by the time they had the salesperson with the high pressure thing to get me to sign up, and they said, well, if you don't like the place, we'll include that for another property. And that was nice, but by then I decided there were some things wrong with that property. The things I didn't really want. You'd pay a lot of money for a big place with tiny bedrooms and no closets and other things. So it's just, okay, so that we'd already decided. But then someone called up, a realtor that my wife knew, and said she heard about another place in Moalboal for sale. So we made the long drive down to Moalboal. It was maybe 2-3 hours or so. And one of the realtor's friends had a little car that we all sort of squeezed into, and we went to look at the place. And it was, actually we liked it. I know there's probably more pictures and things I should have taken, but it seemed, and it does seem rushed. I'd recommend if you're looking for land, take a lot of time. I think sometimes I do things not the optimal way, but they're just what I end up doing. So anyway, we looked at that place. Even the guy that drove, I wanted to try another road to see the neighborhood. He didn't want to do any of that. But there's a lot of people, a retired police officer, and all these other people just hanging around. And later we found out the hanging around thing is that the realtor that we talked with, that we knew, she was on the sales side, and the other was the people that had the listing. And even in the US it works that way. Some person has a listing, the other sells it, and they split the commission. But in this case it was sort of strange, and that there's all these people around. And that sort of followed us throughout the transactions, is that once we decided we wanted it, they'd go to the seller's house and say, hey, we want our money, we want our money, we want our commission, we want our money. Well, they didn't really sold until something was signed and money changed hands. You don't just find that someone that's interested and then you buy it. Things have to really sell. And as far as I'm concerned, they did nothing to help the sale. They sort of intimidated things. In fact, I'll sort of jump ahead, because in the final documents and the final signing, they came back to the realtor side. So the side that knew the person that had the connection and drove the car and did whatever else, they were all 7 of them drove all the way, a few hours, and they came hours early, so they were waiting in a room for many hours to get their money. And of course, this is all cash transactions. This is not a check here or there. And the thing I couldn't figure out is, okay, half goes to the seller, half goes to the buyer sort of situation. The more people that are there, the less each person's going to get. When people show up that no one's seen before, and they're all expecting their share, and they're pissed off they're not getting more money, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. But it certainly put a lot of pressure on the seller coming after her, and the other realtor. They all wanted their money. They didn't want to get cheated, but as far as we're concerned, they didn't really do a whole lot. So they waited, and they eventually did get their money, and it was doled out, and most were happy, but not everybody. Okay, so I'm getting back to the things of selling a place in the Philippines. So there's a notary fee of 1 to 2%, and usually the buyer would pay that. And there's a local transfer fee of around 3/4%. Usually the buyer would pay that. There's a registration fee of 1%. Usually the buyer would pay that. There's a documentary stamp tax, 1.5%. And the seller sort of had us agree to pay a lot of things like the capital gains tax, which if you know about normal taxes, it's not a real capital gains. It's not the money you made, it's just something to change hands. Even if you lose money, they want 6% on that. And that's something that nobody really likes, but that's what you're sort of stuck with if you want to get a place in the Philippines. And then there's a real estate agent fee, which is, they say 3 to 5%. In this case, it was 5%. And obviously the seller would pay that, but we made the agreement that we would get the cash and pay it to the realtors so the seller wouldn't have to do that. So it didn't cost us more, but the seller wasn't the one that spent the money out. And what else is there? Fees, costs. So that comes, cost paid by the buyer, 3.75%. Cost paid by the seller, 3 to 12%. Round trip transaction cost 4.5 to 16 or something percent. So that's like a lot of money that adds up. And so that makes it a little harder to get an expensive piece of property, and you're paying all that money, especially if you're going to sell it again. It would be very hard to come out ahead of time. Even buying a place, you wonder, why buy it? Things aren't doing so well, and home sales are starting to fall around the world. Yeah, there's an exchange rate that's very favorable. So I can afford things I wouldn't be able to afford otherwise. And the exchange rate will probably change, and things will probably get back to normal in some way. Differences in buying or selling property here in the Philippines as opposed to where I'm from in the United States is there when you make an agreement to buy it, the realtor gets out their paper, you sign it, and you give them a certain amount of money, and you've had an agreement to buy, and you have sort of a binding contract that way. And that's all simple and done. Here it doesn't seem to work that way. And when you do them at home, it goes into what they call escrow, and the money sits there, and then checks come in for buying and selling. When everything's ready to close, the seller gets their money, the buyer pays, money comes out of their account, and all the taxes and everything's worked out. So it's all taken care of. Here it's a different system. There's no escrow. So you're paying money to someone, and they're supposed to sign a paper for you. And that's where you might want to have an attorney around to make sure everything's done right and properly. And that's sort of what we had some things, but in this case, when I wanted to buy it, we said, okay, well, they said 3% down. Okay, so we got cash for 3%. We're going to meet with the seller and the real estate agent who's hooked us up with the lawyer she works with or whatever. And did he just have a paper and a form like you can get online and get, there's forms for that called Philippine Legal Forms, and it sort of describes all that there. But no, we wanted to be sure we were covered because it was a new place. So he takes us to this lawyer, and his office isn't as fancy as the other one, but he really spent an hour and a half or 2 hours trying to get us to use him to handle the whole transaction. Well, what does that mean? It's not like you're hiring a professional so minutes an hour and you're going to pay the total. No, he wants 2% of the whole thing, the whole sales price, on top of other fees for transferring the title. And 2% just seemed really steep to me. So here I am, I have the seller, I have all this cash, and I really didn't want to just drop the whole thing, but I didn't want to be pushed into paying 2% to this guy. So finally I said, look, I can't commit to this right now, but I do want to transfer some money, and I want to do this. So, okay, what do I owe you? So there about 6,000 pesos, which is a little more than $100. I showed that paper to the lawyer we eventually hired, and he said he would have charged $10 to do the same thing. But anyway, it just goes to show you, you can't always count on everything being how you want, and you getting the right lawyer at the right price is going to make a really big difference. Then we had another meeting with the seller's lawyer, who was a woman there, and she'd done a lot of work on the title. I don't know if it was all needed or not. I have no way of knowing that. But we didn't want more work than that. She was going to give us all the papers she did, but then she let us copy them and said to do the papers later. But she turned out to be a reasonable person, actually very helpful later, because sometimes I'm suspicious of some lawyers can take a very simple case and make it a complex, expensive thing. And that was not what happened here. So basically we decided, in the steps to buying, it's like a deed of absolute sale, which you have to do. You pay the money and you get that, then you can start the process of transferring the title. And so now the people we were buying the property from, there was a couple. He was in Alaska, then he was going to Montana. He doesn't like the weather here, so we've never met him, basically. And the wife was here. She's Filipino. She's living nearby, and she showed us the place. So now they had to request her money. Well, a certain amount to this account, a certain amount to this, $500,000 pesos, in cash. And then, of course, there was the real estate fees, and there was the down payment. So there's a lot of cash involved. Plus, some of it would be I would be wiring money to them. And that seemed, straightforward. But a lot of things are strange. Okay, to wire money, I need your address. I asked for that, nothing happened. He would just disappear. It's like he ghosted us or something. And that got me a little concerned. There's other things like that, about trying to get, let's send $100 to see that the money wire gets to the right place. Okay, now first I tried another thing, Zelly, which it worked, and he said, I got the money, but it doesn't do large sums of money. So it was sort of useless. So I sent another thing, and did he say, and the lawyer said, get things documented. If you send money, get some way to back up that you sent the money. But he'd say, I told my wife to tell your wife we got the money. Well, that's not really documenting that. There's nothing straightforward from him. You want something that he received the money, he didn't. There was a number of things like that that started getting me very suspicious and scared. I've been around scams before, and when things don't feel right, if you don't act, you regret it later. So I finally came to the point, I think we were meeting Thursday. Originally I was going to wire some money earlier in the week and do the final amount at the meeting. Well, I just got to the point, something too weird, I would not do that. He sent the night before the meeting with the attorneys and the realtors and everything, he sent a thing, unless she gets all the money, she's not going to sign that paper. It's a waste of time. Well, so that seemed like, is it even worth having the meeting? Well, and finally the seller's attorney came in and she said, usually I would just sort of, follow my boss's advice, but in this case, I think you should sign the papers and get this done with. I had already called up my bank to see how much I could wire, and they said, you can wire $50,000. No problem. Because that was within the U.S. wiring. If I was going to send it from Philippines somewhere, because I'd be sending a wire from the U.S. and he was in the U.S., so I had a larger amount. So at the meeting, I said, look, I can get this wire done very quickly. Everything will be taken care of. So that sounded really good, and she signed the papers, and everything seemed to work well. Of course, for me, it was embarrassing when I went up to wire the money, and they said I had a $20,000 limit. Well, what do you mean? I called them, and they said 50, and so I called someone at the bank, and they said, at Chase Bank, said, at a certain time, there's someone will be at this other number that could help you. Well, there was no one there at that number. But someone did their best to convince me there's no way it can happen. This is all random computer. I can't change the computer. The computer decides what can happen. Well, that just didn't go over too well with me. So I tried and once or two more times, and finally got someone, I can show you how to change that. Sure, you go in here, put in the thing, go down there and change your limit, you can wire more money. It's great. I wish the other people working there knew that. So it did end up, we had a bunch of cash, and we distributed the cash. And the papers are signed. And the lawyer's doing the work, and we have the lawyer that's good, cost effective. He's not into gouging us for whatever he can get. He's a nice Christian man, and I appreciate that. Because some people rate how great they are by how much money they make off people. I like people who are great because they do a good job at a reasonable price. One thing we found out, when you're transferring a title, you have till the 5th of the next month to pay all the taxes are owed. So we're going to wait for the final transfer till November, so we'll have December 5th instead of having it done earlier. Although it doesn't really matter, we're willing to do it. So it's a new adventure, basically. It's a place there's a nice road there, but it's not like there's any stores around, not like I can just walk somewhere on my feet, and I don't have a vehicle yet. And, yeah, it's an adventure. And there's nice water right by there to go snorkeling in, and by Moalboal, it's not far from Hanasama. So I look forward to seeing and doing all those things. So I might not be traveling to as many different countries, but I want to set up a base in a beautiful place where I'll happy be. Not that I am enjoying the city of Cebu, but I like the country, I like the outdoors. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching, and hope you learned something. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. We'll be happy to